Hi, I'm Gerry from Gerry's Craft Room, and in this video I'm doing a collaboration with Justine Hovey, who is doing collaborations this whole month with different artists. We each have 5 different tips and techniques that are so amazing that our minds were blown when we first learned them. So make sure to visit Justine's video after mine. I linked to her video in the description box below. I start with the gesso resist technique, and this is super simple, but it gives such a lovely effect that I had to show you. You put some gesso on a scrap piece of paper or an acrylic block and load the sponge with gesso and dab it onto the paper. You don't want too much on the sponge to avoid it going under the stencil. It depends a bit on the thickness of the gesso. You want a nice layer, and this is what it looks like after drying. I use Brilliance ink for the next layer. You can use all sorts of ink for this, even watercolors work. I just add the ink in a circular motion and you can see the pattern of the stencil pop up. It's a bit like magic. We used to have these paper pads as kids that you had to rub on with a pencil and then a picture appeared, and it's a bit the same effect. I keep filling the paper with ink, blending the colors, and this makes a pretty background and pretty fast too. And as always, I added the products I used in the description box for you. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. I used another stencil of the Crafters Workshop with gesso, and here I used Distress Oxide inks on the card, and you can see the gesso resists again perfectly. This ink is more opaque, so if you have a dye ink you will get an even brighter result, as the gesso will show up more white. Again, I keep filling the background and blending the colors. I use the ink blending tool for this. As I use the Distress Oxide inks a lot, I have a sponge applicator for each color I have, and I only have 4 ink blending tools, and that works for me. Usually you work with 3 colors for ink blending like this, and before I start I have the tools ready with the sponges, so you don't have to change the sponges while working on a project. I use a piece of paper to hold the card so I don't get fingerprints in the ink. And there's a little smudge on the card that I will get rid of with the finished card. I wipe over the background to remove the ink on the gesso a bit. And these are the cards I made with the backgrounds. I kept them real simple this time. For the next technique, I have stamped flowers on a card and I added a layer of clear embossing powder. I'm going to color with a brush, and the embossing powder will help. It makes it way easier to color with the soft brush. For this you need a fine pointy tip brush, which makes it easier too. I add my Distress Oxide ink on an acrylic block and I have a bowl of water and some kitchen paper. I'm not using the water brush this time because I don't want to dilute the ink too much. You don't need much ink and you can always add a bit more if needed. I dip my brush in the water and then pick up the first color, and by using this brush you get a deeper color and you can get more color difference to create some shading, and it's also very relaxing to do. And after the first color you clean the brush and wipe it on the kitchen paper or cloth. You can take away some color by adding water and dilute the ink more, and just add color by drying the brush and pick up more of the same color to get a deeper color. This works great with different kinds of ink that can be cleaned with water. It also works with dye inks. When you have a pigment ink, the embossing also works to hold the colors inside the image. It will not dry on the embossing parts. When you do this without the embossing powder, the lines of the stamped image can get covered with the ink when you go over them a bit, and that doesn't look pretty. And you need a paper that can take some water, so a watercolor paper works well. Also, Craft Perfect Ultra Smooth Cardstock, like I'm using here, works great for this kind of coloring. And this is what a finished card looks like. For the next tip, I'm going to use Embellishment Mousse and embossing folders. I colored watercolor card with Nuvo Aqua Faux pens, and I'm going to emboss the card, and I lightly mist the back with water. This helps the card from cracking while embossing with an embossing folder. And this is what it looks like after embossing, and it works really well. Now for this tip, I'm going to make the embossing stand out more by adding Nuvo Embellishment Mousse. I take some out of the jar and put it on an acrylic block. A scrap sheet of paper works great too. And then I add it with my finger. I pick up some of the mousse and rub it on the paper and then on the card. This way I have more control on how much I am adding. And by taking some of the mousse out of the jar, you can close it right away again. This prevents it from drying. It is also recommended to use a tool to get the mousse out, as using your finger could cause any mold to form in the mousse. And I have another background, this time with a 3D embossing folder and Nuvo sprays on watercolor card. And this is what it looks like after embossing. With the 3D embossing folder, I find applying with a sponge works well too. And there's much more texture, so it's easier to apply. And avoid filling the complete background with the mousse. And I know there's a bit more mousse on the second card, as the pattern is not so open as the first pattern. Adding the mousse adds to the depth and the texture of the project. Here are the finished backgrounds and cards. The next trick is one of my favorites. I actually do have a lot of favorites. It's embossing powder blending, and there are different ways you can do this. I start with pressing the die-cut flower in the embossing ink pad. I use a piece of paper to press it in so the sticky ink doesn't get on my fingers. I add the embossing powder and use the craft pick to lift the flower and top off the excess powder and melt it. I let it cool and add more embossing ink. I sprinkle on the next color. And then I wipe away the color from the center with a soft brush, and I use the craft pick to soften any lines, and I will melt it again with the heat tool. For the third layer I add the ink on the petals, and then I add the embossing powder. You can also add the powder to the complete flower and wipe it away again. I soften the lines again with the brush and the craft pick. I wipe the powder off the tips of the petals to get a distressed look. And I'm going to melt the powder again, and this gives 3 blended layers. The first layers of the flower and this embossing powder has glitter in it, which doesn't blend as smooth or easy as regular embossing powder. So for the next example I added a layer of gold glitter embossing powder, and I'm going to make it more smooth. I add a layer of clear embossing powder and then I melt it again. This way it has a smooth finish with a glitter look. Now with more layers of smooth embossing powder you get a gorgeous and easy blending. I add ink to the wings and sprinkle on white embossing powder. And I just melt it like this, and because of the layers you can already see the melted embossing powder move a bit. Another layer in the same way, and I'm going to heat set it again. And you can see the powder blends by itself, so it's super easy. And then just a bit more of the gold on the tips of the wings. And you can see how it blends perfectly. And here's the end result, and here are the cards I made with the flowers and the butterfly. And this is another one of my favorites. It takes a bit more time because it has to dry, but the actual work is really fast. I add the ink on my watercolor card straight with the ink pack. And you start with the lightest color, of course, but if the oxide ink pad gets stained with another color, you can wipe it off real easy. Then spray some water to move the ink. The water is also needed for the salt technique. I have coarse salt and just sprinkle it on the page. And you can see right away that the salt is absorbing color. And the lighter color appears around the salt. And you just let it dry like this. And after drying, you can rub off the salt, and you can keep the colored salt for another project. And now look at this gorgeous texture you get without much effort. And the same goes for ink spray. Just spray it on your project and add the salt. And spray some more water if needed, and then you let it dry. And this gives such a wonderful texture and it's super pretty. Adding water drops like this also adds to the texture. And here's the finished tag and here the finished projects. Make sure to hop on over to Justine's channel for 5 more tips and techniques. She makes gorgeous cards and is super at guest cards and has an amazing channel. And she's a total darling, which is always good. I hope you liked the video. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and make sure to keep on crafting.